Hey guys, welcome back to the Impact Players Linking Shield podcast. I'm so excited to have with me my friend, Dr. Rob McKenna, talking about pressure and pressure testing. We're going to get into that in just a minute. But if you're new to Impact Players is all about inspiring men to be great husbands, fathers, and leaders. And this is what it's all about. Guys like Dr. Rob talking about issues that real men just like you are dealing with. He's got so much wisdom to share with you guys today as we think about pressure testing, what pressure reveals about us. And I got to be honest, right from the get go, and I shared this with you before we even got started, Dr. Rob. I've got a lot on my plate right now. There's so many things that we're doing with Impact Players. We're launching a new chapter in Everett. We just launched our digital online platform, which is, we're hoping, going to be a resource for thousands of men all over the country. Our upcoming Impact Breakfast is right around the corner with former NFL quarterback Jeff Kemp coming up on October 12th. And then we've got our cohorts with guys meeting all over the Puget Sound, training leaders, getting them prepared, getting curriculum written. It's a lot. And so I feel like I'm getting some of that pressure testing right now. So on a personal level, I'm excited to hear what you have to say. And you're the guy to talk about it. I mean, there's really nobody better to talk about it. You wrote the book, which I've got in my hand here, Composed: The Heart and Science of Leading Under Pressure. You did the TED Talk on leading under pressure. You're the guy. So, Dr. Rob, just welcome to this show. Thank you for being here. And let's talk a little bit about being our best when we're in the middle of a pretty tense situation.
Yeah. So where do you want to start, Warren? Where do you want to start with that?
Well, you know, we have something in common that maybe a lot of people don't know, and that is you and I were both competitive tennis players. I played all through college, just like you. I didn't go quite as far as you did, trying to get into the competitive satellite circuit, but whenever I stepped out on the court, I always felt like that one of my greatest assets was my ability to remain composed and to play my best tennis when the pressure was highest.
Hmm.
And I wonder, there is such a great correlation in life between, lessons learned on the field or on the court, and then what we do in the boardroom or in our home, or just dealing with tension that may come from a variety of different sources. So I wonder, as you look back on your sports background, your sports
Mhm.
career,
Hmm.
what are some of those connections that you've seen when it comes to being able to be your best in a sports environment, and how that translates into other areas of life now, kind of post tennis career?
Yeah. I'm cracking up, Warren, because I've been asked, so many questions over the years about leading under pressure. I don't know if anyone has ever tried to dig up all my ghosts about my athletic past. Uh, I'm serious. I don't know if anyone, and I think I relate to it because I think a lot of what I talk about now, I can make direct connections into athletics, and tennis specifically. And I think the other thing about it is my team at Wild Leaders says this all the time. Like when they introduce me, they'll say like, not only is he an expert on pressure, he deals with it every day. So it's, or whatever
Mm,
the topic is like I just don't have a lot of faith in people who are out there speaking on things as if they've got it all figured out. I
yeah.
just do not believe that's the case. I think the people that have the best credibility to me are the ones who are still, they would openly tell you, I still struggle with vulnerability. I still struggle with compassion. I still struggle with pressure.
Mm,
Um, and so I hope that's okay, because that's kind of who I am. And I would say that one of the things that I think is interesting in what you were describing is people ask me over the years, like, what is pressure? Like, why pressure? Like, why does it matter?
Right.
And the way I describe pressure is as an invisible force that tells you that something is changing.
Mm.
And I think it's that if there's something that we all share when it comes to pressure, and so fundamentally pressure is about change. And so when something changes, and it can change in a moment,
Mm.
suddenly that's when we feel that force. And there's physics behind that too. I could go down that whole path around,
Mm.
when molecules hit the side of a container, and that's what causes pressure to increase inside of a container as
Mm.
like when things heat up, all those pieces of that. But I think it's also when you were describing the realities that you face, even in this moment of your life,
Yeah.
you describe some of the things that are happening in impact players, is that those are all either large or micro changes that are, it's when something is going to become something different. And so quite literally a pressure can be a conversation that you've got to have that
Mhm.
may shift that relationship. It may be a shift from we're going to shift from using, I always use this silly example, but using Google Sheets to Excel. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Organization, like those things freak people out. And fundamentally why it matters is because of change. And so and then what got interesting is I got very interested in this not just like the effects of the specific effects of pressure on us personally. Like, what
Mm.
is it that happens emotionally and psychologically under pressure, that we could study and understand, so that we could help other people be more composed and be their best selves in those kinds of moments. And going back to sports for just a minute before I unpack all that, I'll wait on your question around that as we get in deeper into sort of that whole thing of how do people respond? What did you learn? But as with sports, I have to pause because like I said, people have not asked me that before. And if I'm honest, I really struggled with composure and composing myself. And tennis is a great example. I'm this, like, it
Mm.
is one of the most psychologically challenging sports I'm aware of. First of all, it's all on you.
Yeah.
So if you're a singles player, like, you don't have even the doubles dynamic. Like, there's a sense in which you're kind of not only playing your opponent, but you're playing yourself.
Absolutely. You're on
And
an island. Yeah.
there's nothing that brings up psychological baggage like trying to play tennis well. I mean, I can still see my dad's face watching.
Mm.
You know what I mean? I can still hear my mother's voice telling me things that she and my dad would talk about related to, the way that I played, or things they appreciated, things I could be better at. I can picture my friends. I can picture moments where I literally felt sorry for a friend because I was beating him badly.
Mm.
And it got in the way of me actually winning. Like, it's like, it's weird stuff, and probably with them too. And so there are a few things like tennis, I think, and all sports do it. I can picture myself at the free throw line
Mm.
in high school when suddenly I got too aware of who was watching in the stands, and my elbow froze, and I just shot the biggest brick you could ever imagine.
Mm.
So, like, remaining composed, and that's why I'm like, and that's just a small sampling of sort of the reality that we face in way higher stakes situations.
Mm.
And my work and research was really driven by how do we continue to be our best selves when that next high pressure moment comes.
Right.
When that change, that slight, that cellular level shift happens, or that massive shift happens, how do we continue to be our best selves? That's where it started.
Yeah. And as I'm thinking about this, especially when you get out of sports, um, but if you read enough sports biographies and hear people's stories, you see that sometimes the pressure manifests itself in the moment of the game, but then oftentimes it's later in another setting, in another situation where the pressure really causes a lot of the problems, and I
Yeah.
think for men especially, when you're dealing with a lot of pressure at work, maybe you perform well there, but then you get home and you're not the man that you want to be. You're not the husband that you want to be. I remember as a young dad dealing with a lot of pressure in my career, and I would have to stop a block from the house before I got home and just get my head right and
Yeah.
and pray. and just try to get, ready, because I knew I was going to walk through the door and I was going to have two kids going bonkers that wanted to play and be at high energy, and my wife was going to be exhausted, and all of those things. We've all been there. But how do you kind of maybe think through, manage the corollary effects of pressure?
So a couple things. One, let me tell you what we found, and then I'll tell you the how. That is surprising to a lot of people is that, first of all, when I described pressure, sometimes that pressure is interpersonal. So it's between us. That's the most common thing, between us and someone else. Sometimes it's intrapersonal. So it's actually something that's happening within us. So I don't even have to have anyone even talking to me to feel pressure on a tennis court. You know what I mean? So there's something that's just, it's almost like I'm having a conversation with myself emotionally.
Yeah.
And then the third one is what I described as an environmental pressure. And that's what I set up in my book, was like this. Sometimes there's things that aren't interpersonal, but it's things that are happening in the environment that are creating that change, that's then causing that pressure, that force to feel like it's rising up in me. What we found was this, and I am not the first researcher, practitioner, or theorist to think about this, because there's been some amazing work on this. What we found, and this was through multiple longitudinal studies, like where we studied groups of leaders across several years of their life. And the common factor was that people have a default. They have an emotional default. And that default can change based on different circumstances. So like when you were talking about home versus work, I've had people describe to me, and they say like, hey, why am I this way at home and why am I this way at work? And the defaults, I'm really careful about labels, but I'm going to give you a couple, but in hopes that you'll see that they're developmental and they're not like, it's not personality. It's not, you aren't stuck in these labels, but they do help people to have handholds, like in terms of what are these defaults? What we found is that people will default to one of two possibilities. Some people under pressure will become more what I describe as a peacekeeper.
Yeah.
And their emotional tendency will be, everything in them will be causing them to try to make sure everyone else is doing okay, and especially is okay with them. So it's like, it's not like an unselfish response, but it's like I'm just going to do everything I can to make sure you're happy with me and you're feeling good.
That's the people pleaser. That's the
That's the
person
pleaser.
that
Yep.
just avoids conflict, avoids confrontation.
Yeah. Okay. And we have a lot of leaders, very high level to first level leaders, who function that way. They're not bad people. I say that over and over again, but they have an emotional tendency in certain situations to go there. Right. And what's interesting is a lot of times if I'm speaking about this to an audience, I'll see a bunch of people like nodding their heads. You know what I mean? Yeah. They'll be like, I get you. Where are we going next? I need more of this. There'll be another group in the audience who does not even understand what I just described. And so they're like, and I described them. Now, again, be careful of the labels, but the true speakers. There are some people who really under pressure, they'll be like, I know what we should do. I know what's important to me. I'm going to tell you what's important to me. True speakers are needed for different reasons than the peacekeepers. The challenge with them is they typically are hidden from, or they're absent from all the other data that's on the table. So true speakers, people like this, tend to be very clear, but they're clear about what's important to them with a decreased capacity to stay connected to what's going on in everybody else. And they're a little harder.
They're the ones that can kind of be the bull in the china shop. They can be
absolutely.
They're less empathetic. They're so focused on the mission that sometimes, they can kind of move forward without consideration for others' feelings.
And I would go further to say that it's not just the mission; they're focused on themselves.
Okay.
They would call it the mission, but it's like there's this reality that there's a bit of that. Now we need those kinds of people who are like that. But what I would say in terms of being able to help a leader is, if the number one factor for us to work with a person is their capacity and willingness to pay attention to what the default is. So it's harder to get through to the true speakers, because they're like, okay, this is kind of a waste of time, all the emotional stuff you're talking about, McKenna. But here's the reality is, like, they got work to do. And so I've told many a CEO, they're like, so what am I supposed to do? I'm true speaker under pressure. I'm like, you need to shut up. You need to shut up. And what's interesting is that so often, you know what they'll say to me? They'll say, I get it. How do I do that? So most people think that they'll react against that. And And I got to tell you, Warren, it's so funny. I spoke to a group of 500 high school football coaches once. This was a few years
Yeah.
back. And this coach came up afterwards. He's up on the stage and he's like, all right, Dr. Rob, I get it. I understand all this stuff. He goes, I was a Marine, I was a firefighter, football coach. So I really get all this stuff. But I got this other question for you. And his wife's standing behind him going, and it's like, it just not shaking her head.
Right.
Because she's like, he does not get this at all.
Yeah.
So my first layer, for anyone who's listening to this, would be the important thing is to identify your default. And when I say default, what I mean, what is it that happens within you
Mm-hmm.
if you were to do nothing, if you were to just act out of compulsion, if you're not going to move forward with intention, but just going to do what is normal for you to do. And so, and I think the reality is it does vary depending on whether people are at work or at home or in different contexts, because different systems, we function differently emotionally in those different places.
Yeah. I mean, I'm processing this out loud with you, and I can see how I am different in different scenarios. My defunct is to be a people pleaser. You know, I want everybody to be happy. I want people to be pleased with me. And yet I've got this other part of me that is super ambitious and
that's
wants to get this thing done. And there are times where I just feel like, okay, I've got to put on this hat. And this is the hat of, I'm going to tell you what needs to happen. And I laugh because, you know, there are times where I look at myself almost from like the outside, like if you're kind of like observing yourself as a spectator and you're like, wow, like when did I become such a contrarian in certain settings? And that was not me 25 years ago. But now, I feel so strongly about certain things that I'm like, no, that's not how it is. That's not what we're going to do. We're going to move forward this way. And, and so then I've got to now kind of reevaluate, is that the right way? Is that the appropriate response in that pressure packed situation?
Yeah. I get you so well. I understand. And I have, if I had a natural tendency, a default, I would say that I relate to that, that peacekeeper part, but I also relate to, but people would describe me as extremely convicted. And so at the same time, I have a strong truth speaker that comes out, but I've had to understand the context within which those things emerge. And it's why I spent, like in the Wild Toolkit, this whole intentional process that we use in organizations, these 10 developmental tools. One of them is called the Leading Under Pressure Inventory, because it's all about assessing. The first piece of that puzzle is to assess which is your default. And then what it does is it unpacks what are the strategies, what are the things I could do, which I'd love to get to, is to give people some pathways. Like I didn't want to just know, it's one thing to say, okay, yeah, I identified my emotional tendency.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I'm a true speaker, a peacekeeper. I understand I do it. Here's how I show up and why in different situations, but I'm also a problem solver. So I was like, let's study what it is that allowed leaders and people to do both at the same time.
Well, and I want to hear what some of those practices, techniques are. But first, let's just nail down why it's so important, because one of my favorite quotes was by another one of our impact speakers, John Beasley. He came a couple years ago and he opened up his talk by saying, the greatest gift you can give your family is a non-anxious presence. And man, I can't tell you how many times over the last couple years during the pandemic, during all of this, just divisiveness in our culture, that I've just been reminded of that idea that the best thing I can bring to this house, to this situation, to this staff meeting, to this controversial, conversation that we're having, the best thing I can give is a non-anxious presence. And to me, that's what being composed is.
Yeah.
Is that I'm not reacting, I'm responding.
Yeah.
I I cannot control whatever is coming out of you, but I need to be responsible for controlling what is coming out of me.
Yeah.
So, why is that so important to have that ability to compose yourself in those high pressure moments? Not just the personal physical benefit, but what it does for you as a leader in those moments.
Yeah. First of all, I know some of the people who he was mentored under, because I was mentored under the same great thinkers, because that term, a non-anxious presence, there are some amazing people who studied generations of families, and that's where that
Mhm,
came from.
mhm.
And it's why and I just compose is just a sort of a little bit more street level